It was 2 in the morning on a rain-slick Tuesday when 20-year-old Lydia Bennett locked eyes with the most dangerous man in New York. The air in the underground VIP lounge was thick with expensive cigar smoke and unspoken secrets, but all it took was a fraction of a second. One deliberate, silent movement of her hand. She didn't speak a single word yet. That microscopic gesture shattered her ordinary life forever. Lydia thought she was just saving a stranger's life. She didn't know she had just bound her soul to a mob boss. The neon glow of the city bled through the frosted glass of the Onyx Room, Manhattan's most exclusive and heavily guarded private lounge. To the outside world, it was an upscale jazz club for Wall Street billionaires and tech moguls. But to the people who worked there, it was neutral ground for the city's apex predators. Lydia Bennett was 20 years old, exhausted and drowning. She wasn't supposed to be swimming in these waters. Most girls her age were in college worrying about final exams and weekend parties. Lydia was worrying about the crippling $150,000 gambling debt her estranged father had abandoned her with when he vanished 6 months ago. The debt belonged to the Castellano crime family, a brutal syndicate that didn't care if the daughter was innocent. They only cared about the money. Working as a premium bottle service waitress at the Onyx Room was the only way she could make the kind of cash required to keep the debt collectors from breaking her legs. She wore the club's uniform, a tailored midnight blue silk dress that fell just above the knee, modest enough to be classy, form-fitting enough to keep the tips flowing. She was invisible by design. In this world, the staff were meant to be nothing more than ghosts pouring $1,000 liquor. You don't look the patrons in the eye. You don't listen to their conversations. You pour, you nod, and you walk away. That rule kept Lydia alive. Until the night Dominic Russo walked in. The atmosphere in the club physically shifted the moment the heavy mahogany doors swung open. The low murmur of conversation evaporated. The jazz pianist missed half a beat. Lydia, who was balancing a silver tray of champagne flutes near the bar, felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Dominic Russo was 32, the newly anointed head of the Russo syndicate after his father's violent passing 2 months prior. He didn't look like the mobsters from the movies. He wore a bespoke charcoal Brioni suit that fit his broad shoulders perfectly. His dark hair was meticulously styled, and his features looked as though they had been carved from cold marble. But it was his eyes that froze people in their tracks, a piercing, icy blue that seemed to dissect everything they rested upon. He moved with the quiet, terrifying grace of a predator that knew it had no natural enemies in the room. Flanking him was Leo Moretti, his childhood friend and ruthless underboss, a man whose easy smile hid a reputation for extreme violence. Behind them were 4 heavily armed men who melted into the shadows of the club's perimeter. Lydia retreated to the service station, her heart hammering against her ribs. The Russos and the Castellanos were currently engaged in a brutal Cold War over control of the docks in Brooklyn. The tension in the city had been suffocating, and seeing Dominic Russo sitting casually in a booth on Castellano territory felt like watching someone light a match in a room full of gasoline. "Don't look," whispered Chloe, an older waitress pulling Lydia by the elbow toward the prep counter. "Whenever Russo comes in, someone usually leaves in a body bag. Keep your head down, Lydia." "I know," Lydia breathed, smoothing down her silk dress. "I'm just going to finish my shift and get out of here." But fate, it seemed, had a very different plan for her. At 2:15 a.m., the floor manager, a sweaty, nervous man named Paul, aggressively grabbed Lydia's shoulder. "Russo's table. They ordered the Macallan 60. Take it over, now." Lydia frowned. "That's VIP section 4. That's Thomas's section." "Thomas is busy." Paul snapped, his voice trembling slightly. He shoved a heavy silver tray into her hands. On it rested a crystal decanter of dark amber liquid and 2 heavy rocks glasses. "Just serve the damn drink, Lydia, and get out of there." Lydia took the tray, her intuition flaring. As she turned toward the bar, she caught a glimpse of Thomas, the senior waiter, standing near the staff exit. He was deathly pale, sweating profusely, and clutching a thick manila envelope that hadn't been there 10 minutes ago. More terrifyingly, Lydia had seen Thomas hovering over the prep station just seconds before Paul handed her the tray. A cold spike of adrenaline pierced Lydia's chest. She looked down at the crystal decanter. The liquid looked normal, but the pieces snapped together in her mind with horrifying clarity. Thomas's panic, the sudden envelope of cash, Paul forcing her to take the tray instead of Thomas likely to distance the staff from the immediate fallout. It's poisoned, she realized. The Castellanos got to the staff. They're making a hit right here. Lydia stopped dead in her tracks in the middle of the crowded floor. If she served the drink and Dominic died, the Russo men would slaughter everyone in the club, starting with the girl who poured the glass. If she dropped the tray and screamed, the Castellano operatives hiding in the club would kill her for ruining the hit. She was trapped in a lethal crossfire, a pawn in a billionaire's blood sport. She took a slow, deep breath, her survival instincts kicking into overdrive. She couldn't speak. She couldn't panic. She had to warn him without letting the rest of the room know she was warning him. Lydia approached the dimly lit corner booth. Leo Moretti stepped in her path, his hand casually resting inside his tailored jacket right over his holster. "Drinks for Mr. Russo," Lydia said, her voice steady despite the hurricane in her chest. Leo patted her down with his eyes, found her unthreatening, and stepped aside. Lydia walked to the table. Dominic Russo was leaning back against the leather booth, casually smoking a cigarette. Up close, he was devastatingly handsome, but the aura of danger radiating off him was almost suffocating. She set the silver tray down on the table. Her hands didn't shake. She picked up the first crystal glass and set it in front of Dominic. Then she picked up the heavy decanter. Dominic didn't look at her. His icy blue eyes were scanning the room. Lydia poured the scotch. As she set the decanter down, she deliberately reached for a square black cocktail napkin. Instead of placing it under the glass, normally she flipped it upside down, a universal bartender code for a cutoff or a compromised drink. But she knew a mafia boss might not know hospitality codes. She needed to be sure. With her thumb holding the napkin against the table, she firmly pressed her nail into the thick paper, dragging it in a sharp, distinct X right beside his glass. Dominic's eyes snapped from the crowd directly to her hands. He saw the X. Lydia slowly lifted her gaze. For the first time all night, she broke the cardinal rule. She looked the mafia boss dead in the eyes, her hazel eyes locked onto his piercing blue ones. She didn't blink. With deliberate, agonizing slowness, Lydia tapped the rim of his crystal glass twice with her pinky finger. Then, maintaining eye contact, she gave the subtlest of nods toward the bar, specifically in the direction of the manager, Paul, and the fleeing waiter, Thomas. A silent conversation passed between them in the span of 3 seconds. The drink is spiked. The staff is compromised. Dominic Russo's expression didn't change. Not a muscle in his face twitched, but a dark, lethal shadow crossed his eyes. He understood perfectly. "Thank you, sweetheart," Dominic said. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone that sent a shiver straight down Lydia's spine. Lydia bowed her head, picked up her empty tray, and walked away. Her legs felt like lead. She had just inserted herself into a mafia war. She didn't make it to the kitchen before the chaos started. "Paul," Dominic's voice suddenly carried over the low jazz music, commanding and cold. "Come here." Lydia paused near the service doors, looking back over her shoulder. The floor manager, shaking like a leaf, approached the booth. "Mr. Russo, is everything all right with the service?" Paul stammered. "The service is exceptional," Dominic said smoothly, picking up the glass of Macallan. He held it up to the light. "But I don't like drinking alone. Have a drink with me, Paul." Paul's face drained of all color. I couldn't, sir. I'm on the clock." Leo Moretti stepped up behind Paul, his hand clamping down on the manager's shoulder with bone-crushing force. "The boss offered you a drink, Paul. Drink it." Please," Paul gasped, looking wildly around the room. Dominic slammed the glass onto the table. "Drink it, or Leo puts a bullet in your kneecap right here in front of everyone." Trembling violently, Paul picked up the glass. He brought it to his lips, tears streaming down his face. He took a sip. 3 seconds later, Paul began to choke. He dropped the glass, the expensive crystal shattering against the floor, and collapsed, clutching his throat foam bubbling at the corners of his mouth. The club erupted into pure bedlam. Women screamed. Men scrambled for the exits. "Lock the doors!" Leo roared, pulling a suppressed Glock from his jacket. "Nobody leaves!" Lydia backed through the swinging kitchen doors, her chest heaving. She had to run. She grabbed her coat from the locker room and sprinted toward the alley exit. She pushed the heavy steel door open, the freezing New York rain hitting her face. She made it exactly 3 steps into the alley before a massive, immovable figure stepped out of the shadows blocking her path. It was Leo Moretti. He had his gun aimed casually at the ground, but his eyes were locked onto her. "Going somewhere, sweetheart?" Leo asked, tilting his head. Before Lydia could answer, Dominic Russo stepped out into the rain behind Leo. He looked perfectly calm, entirely unaffected by the man dying on his table inside. He walked up to Lydia, the rain dampening his expensive suit. He looked down at her, his icy eyes burning with intense curiosity and terrifying authority. "You saved my life," Dominic said quietly, the rain masking the sound of sirens in the distance. "I don't know what you're talking about," Lydia lied, her voice shaking. "Please let me go home." Dominic reached out his warm, rough fingers gently but firmly, lifting her chin so she had to look at him. "The men who paid Paul to poison me are going to check the security tapes. They're going to see you making that little scratch on the napkin. By tomorrow morning, Victor Castellano will have a bounty on your head, so high your own neighbors will try to collect it." Lydia's breath hitched. "No, I just poured the drink." "You are a liability to them now," Dominic stated factually. He dropped his hand from her face and turned toward a sleek, armored black SUV pulling into the alley. "Get in the car." "What? No?" Lydia backed up. "I'm not going anywhere with you." Dominic stopped and turned back to her. The dangerous aura returned heavy and suffocating. "You intervened in my world, Lydia. You made a choice. Right now there are 2 options for you. You walk out of this alley alone, and Victor's men find you, torture you, and leave you in the East River, or you get in my car and I keep you breathing." He took a step closer, towering over her. "You belong to me now. Get in the car." The interior of the armored SUV smelled of expensive leather and gunpowder. Lydia sat stiffly against the door, her knees pressed tightly together, her soaked coat clinging to her shivering frame. Dominic sat opposite her, casual, scrolling through a burner phone. Leo sat in the front passenger seat, barking rapid-fire orders in rapid, furious Italian to someone on the other end of a radio. "We lost Thomas!" Leo snarled, glancing back at Dominic. "He slipped out the delivery bay before Paul hit the floor. My guys are sweeping his apartment, but he's likely halfway to Victor's safe house by now." Dominic didn't look up from his phone. "Burn Thomas's apartment. Leave a message. I want Victor to know he missed." Lydia squeezed her eyes shut. She was sitting in a car with monsters discussing arson and murder as casually as discussing the weather. "What is your name?" Dominic's voice cut through the silence. Lydia opened her eyes. He was looking at her now, the phone discarded. "Lydia," she whispered. "Lydia Bennett." Dominic's eyes narrowed slightly. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, invading her space. "Tell me something, Lydia Bennett. Why did a 20-year-old waitress risk her life to save a man she knows is a criminal?" "I didn't do it for you." Lydia shot back, a sudden desperate bravery flaring in her chest. "If you died in that booth, your men would have started shooting. I would have been caught in the crossfire. I saved myself." A slow, dark smirk played on the corner of Dominic's lips. It was a terrifying sight. Resourceful and perceptive. "How did you know the drink was spiked?" "Thomas was sweating," Lydia said, staring at her hands. "He had an envelope of cash in his pocket that wasn't there before his break, and Paul forced me to take his section. It didn't make sense. In a club like that, nobody gives up a VIP table tip unless they're running from something." Dominic glanced at Leo in the front seat. Leo let out a low whistle. "She's got a better eye than half our lookouts, boss." "Indeed," Dominic murmured, leaning back. The car pulled up to a massive gated compound in the Hamptons. Iron gates swung open, revealing a sprawling stone mansion surrounded by armed guards holding automatic rifles in the pouring rain. Lydia felt her stomach bottom out. It looked like a fortress. She was entirely cut off from the real world now. Once inside, the sheer opulence of the estate was dizzying. Marble floors, vaulted ceilings, and priceless art. But Lydia couldn't focus on any of it. She stood dripping wet in the grand foyer as Dominic shrugged off his wetsuit jacket, handing it to a silent maid. "Give her a dry set of clothes and put her in the East Wing guest room," Dominic ordered the maid. Locked the door from the outside. 2 guards in the hallway. "Wait!" Lydia shouted as Dominic turned to walk away. "You said you were going to protect me. You can't just lock me up like a prisoner." Dominic slowly turned back to her. The smirk was gone. He walked toward her until he was mere inches away, his presence entirely overwhelming. "You are a prisoner." "Lydia," he said, his voice a lethal whisper, "you are a prisoner of the circumstance you created. Victor Castellano isn't just a rival, he is a butcher, and thanks to my intelligence network, I just found out exactly why you work at that club." Lydia's heart stopped. "Your father," Dominic continued, his eyes devoid of pity. "Richard Bennett, a pathetic degenerate who racked up 150 grand in gambling debts at Victor's underground casinos. Victor has been letting you pay it off piece by piece, keeping you trapped as his little earner." Tears pricked Lydia's eyes. "How do you know that?" "I know everything that happens in my city," Dominic said coldly. "By saving my life tonight, you just stole Victor's prize kill. Do you think Victor cares about your father's debt anymore? To him, you just became an enemy combatant." Lydia felt her knees go weak. She staggered back, hitting the marble wall. My mother. She's in a care facility. If I don't pay them, Victor said he'll go after her," Dominic finished for her. "Yes, that is exactly what he will do." A sob tore from Lydia's throat. She slid down the wall, pulling her knees to her chest. She had ruined everything. She had tried to do the right thing to survive, and instead, she had doomed her mother and herself. Dominic stood over her for a long moment, watching her break down. In his world, weakness was a death sentence. But as he looked at the girl who had stared danger in the face just an hour ago to save his life, something foreign shifted in his chest. He knelt down, his expensive dress pants touching the wet floor. He reached out, his large hand gripping her shoulder, forcing her to look up at him. "Listen to me very carefully," Dominic said, his voice dropping to a low, intense register. "Victor will not touch your mother. He will not touch you. Your father's debt is no longer your concern." Lydia sniffled, looking into his cold blue eyes. Why would you help me?" "Because you did me a service," Dominic said. "And a Russo always pays his debts. I will buy your father's debt from Victor. I will move your mother to a secure facility under my private guard." Lydia's eyes widened. You would do that?" "Yes," Dominic said. "But my protection is not charity, Lydia. It comes with a price." "What price?" she asked, her voice trembling. Dominic stood up, his towering figure casting a long shadow over her. "Victor is obsessed with appearances. If he knows you're just a random waitress I saved, he will wage an all-out war to get you back to save his pride. There's only one way he won't touch you. Only one way the other families will accept that you are off limits." "What is it?" Lydia asked, rising slowly to her feet. Dominic looked at her, his eyes burning with a dark, territorial fire. "Tomorrow morning I am announcing to the 5 families that you are my fiancée. You are going to play the part of the future Mrs. Russo. You live in my house, you sleep in my bed, and you belong to me until I say otherwise. Do we have a deal?" The morning sun over the Atlantic Ocean was blindingly bright, pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the East Wing guest room. Lydia awoke with a gasp, her heart hammering against her ribs as the memories of the previous night crashed over her like a tidal wave. The onyx room, the poisoned drink, Paul collapsing, Dominic Russo. She sat up, the expensive Egyptian cotton sheets pooling around her waist. The room she'd been placed in was the size of a standard Manhattan apartment. It was decorated in muted tones of cream and slate, devoid of any personal touches, yet screaming of unfathomable wealth. There was a marble fireplace, a massive king-sized bed, and a set of heavy French doors that opened to a private balcony. But as Lydia swung her legs out of bed and approached the doors, she noticed the subtle, reinforced steel latches. The balcony was beautiful, but it was sealed shut. She was locked in a glass box. A sharp knock at the heavy oak door made her jump. Before she could answer, the lock clicked open from the outside. In walked a severe-looking woman in a tailored gray suit carrying a garment bag. Behind her were two men who looked completely out of place in a mob boss's home. One was carrying a large makeup case, the other a series of velvet jewelry boxes. "Good morning, Miss Bennett," the woman said briskly, her tone leaving no room for argument. "My name is Sarah. Mr. Russo expects you downstairs in the study in exactly 90 minutes. We have a considerable amount of work to do before your meeting with Mr. Braffman." "Who is Mr. Braffman?" Lydia asked, clutching her silk robe tightly around her. "Benjamin Braffman." A deep, gravelly voice answered from the hallway. Dominic Russo stepped into the room. In the harsh daylight, without the shadows of the underground club, he was even more intimidating. He wore a crisp white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing faint dark ink trailing up his right forearm. He wasn't wearing a tie, and the top two buttons of his shirt were undone, but the casual look did nothing to soften the lethal energy he radiated. "He is one of the most ruthless, high-profile defense attorneys in New York," Dominic explained, stepping past the stylists and approaching Lydia. "If the five families are going to believe that I am marrying a 20-year-old waitress out of nowhere, the federal government is going to notice. The DOJ has been looking for an excuse to wiretap this estate for a year. A sudden, unexplainable marriage to a civilian is a red flag. Braffman is here to draft a prenuptial agreement, so ironclad and legally complex that it creates a perfectly documented paper trail of a legitimate whirlwind romance. It grounds our lie in legal reality." Lydia stared at him, her mind spinning at the sheer scale of his operation. "You're bringing in a real celebrity lawyer to lie to the government?" "I don't lie to the government, Lydia. I overwhelm them with paperwork," Dominic said smoothly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy black velvet box. "Hold out your hand." Lydia hesitated. Her hands were trembling. Slowly, she extended her left hand. Dominic snapped the box open. Resting on the black velvet was a diamond so massive and clear it caught the morning sunlight and threw prisms across the walls. It was a flawless emerald-cut diamond flanked by tapered baguettes, easily 5 carats set in platinum. "It belonged to my grandmother." Dominic lied smoothly, though Lydia could see the cold calculation in his eyes. "At least that is what you will tell the society reporters tonight at the Plaza Hotel. In reality, I had my jeweler open his vault at 4 this morning." He took her cold, shaking hand in his warm, calloused one. His grip was firm but surprisingly gentle as he slid the ring onto her 4th finger. The platinum was freezing against her skin. It felt less like a piece of jewelry and more like a heavy, glittering shackle. "From this moment forward, you do not take this off," Dominic instructed, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "When you walk with the posture of a woman who owns the room. When you speak with the quiet confidence of someone who has the full violent weight of the Russo family behind her. You are no longer Lydia Bennett, the terrified girl with a gambling debt. You are Lydia Bennett, the future queen of my syndicate. Do you understand?" "I don't know how to be that person," Lydia whispered, looking up into his icy blue eyes. "You don't have to know how," Dominic replied, stepping back. "You just have to let me lead. Sarah will get you ready. Be downstairs at 10. For the next 90 minutes, Lydia was poked, prodded, painted, and styled. The exhausted, pale girl from the club was scrubbed away. Her chestnut hair was blown out into voluminous, sleek waves. Her makeup was applied to look effortlessly flawless, accentuating her hazel eyes and high cheekbones. Sarah helped her step into a day dress, a stunning tailored ivory sheath dress by Carolina Herrera that fit her like a glove. When she finally walked down the sweeping mahogany staircase, her legs felt like lead. She found Dominic in a massive oak-paneled study lined with thousands of leather-bound books. Sitting across from him was a man in his late 60s, impeccably dressed with a sharp, calculating gaze. Ah, the blushing bride, Benjamin Braffman said, standing up and offering a polite practice smile. Miss Bennett, it is a pleasure. Dominic has told me quite a bit about your sudden courtship. Lydia forced a smile, shaking the lawyer's hand. It's nice to meet you, Mr. Braffman. Please sit, Braffman instructed, gesturing to a thick stack of legal documents on the desk. We are drafting a post-nuptial framework disguised as a prenup. To make this convincing to the federal auditors who will inevitably subpoena these records, we are putting a considerable amount of assets in your name. Trust funds, a property in Aspen, and a directorship on the board of one of the Russo's shell logistics companies. Lydia looked at Dominic, her eyes wide. You're giving me a house in Aspen. I am giving you a paper trail, Dominic corrected coldly, not looking up from the contract he was reviewing. Sign where Benjamin tells you to sign. For an hour, Lydia signed her name on dozens of pages, effectively tying her identity, her finances, and her life to a man she had met less than 24 hours ago. She was signing away her soul, but as she thought of her mother, resting safely in the Mount Sinai private care facility, a transfer Dominic had somehow orchestrated before dawn, she gripped the Mont Blanc pen tighter and signed her name again. The Plaza Hotel was a beacon of old-world Manhattan glamour, its grand ballroom dripping in crystal chandeliers and gold leaf. Tonight, it was hosting the annual St. Jude's Charity Gala, an event where the city's billionaires, politicians, and hidden criminals gathered to buy goodwill. Lydia sat in the back of Dominic's armored Maybach, staring out at the flashing lights of the paparazzi swarming the hotel entrance. She was wearing a breathtaking, plunging emerald green silk gown that left her shoulders bare and cascaded to the floor. Around her neck sat a diamond tennis necklace that cost more than she could earn in 3 lifetimes. Dominic sat beside her, radiating a tense, predatory energy. He wore a classic black tuxedo, looking devastatingly handsome, but his eyes were constantly moving, scanning the perimeter. Listen to me, Dominic said, his voice cutting through the silence of the cabin. Victor Castellano is inside. He is a prominent donor to this charity. He cannot afford to cause a scene in front of the mayor and the chief of police, but he will try to corner you. He wants to see if you crack. Lydia felt a cold sweat break out on her palms. What do I do if he speaks to me? You smile, Dominic said, turning to face her. You act like you haven't a care in the world, and you do not leave my side. Not for a drink, not for the restroom. You are my shadow tonight. The driver opened the door, and the roar of the photographers washed over them. Dominic stepped out first, adjusting his cuffs before turning and offering his hand to Lydia. The moment her fingers touched his, he pulled her out of the car and seamlessly wrapped his arm around her bare waist, pulling her flush against his side. The physical contact sent a jolt of electricity straight down her spine. His grip was possessive, a clear, unspoken warning to every man with a camera and every mobster in the crowd. They walked the red carpet. Lydia flashed the massive diamond on her finger, burying her terror beneath a plastic smile. The whispers started immediately. Reporters shouted questions asking who she was, where Dominic had been hiding her, and when the wedding was. Dominic ignored them all, guiding her smoothly into the opulent ballroom. The atmosphere inside was stifling. Jazz music floated over the clinking of champagne glasses, but to Lydia, it felt like walking through a minefield. She could feel the stares. The wealthy socialites looked at her with a mix of envy and disdain, while the hardened men in tailored suits, men who looked like polished versions of Leo Moretti, eyed her with dangerous curiosity. Breathe more, mio, Dominic murmured, leaning down so his lips brushed her ear. The term of endearment, though entirely fake, made Lydia's breath hitch. "You're doing perfectly. Keep your chin up." They mingled for an hour. Dominic introduced her to senators, real estate tycoons, and union bosses. Lydia played her part, laughing at unfunny jokes, sipping politely at her champagne, and leaning into Dominic's touches. Then, the temperature in the room seemed to plummet. "Dominic, my boy!" A smooth, cultured voice rang out. Lydia froze. Dominic's hand tightened on her waist like a vice. They turned around to face Victor Castellano. Victor was in his late 50s, an impeccably groomed man with silver hair and a warm, grandfatherly smile that didn't quite reach his dead shark-like eyes. He was flanked by three massive men who looked entirely out of place in tuxedos. "Victor," Dominic replied, his voice perfectly even, devoid of the hatred Lydia knew boiled beneath the surface. "You're looking well. I wasn't sure you'd make it tonight, considering the sudden loss of your operations manager this morning." Lydia knew Dominic was talking about the club hit. Victor had lost his men. Victor's smile tightened for a fraction of a second. "Tragic, yes. The city is full of unexpected hazards. One must be very careful about where they put their trust. And speaking of unexpected," Victor's dead eyes slid over to Lydia. The weight of his gaze was physically nauseating. "You must introduce me to your beautiful fiancée." "Lydia Bennett," Dominic said smoothly. "Lydia, this is Victor Castellano, an old business associate of my father's." Bennett." Victor repeated, tasting the name. He took a step closer to Lydia, invading her personal space. The smell of expensive cologne and stale cigar smoke washed over her. "You know, Lydia, I once knew a Bennett. A man named Richard, a terrible gambler, owed money to some very unsavory people. He vanished without a trace. I hope for your sake you have better luck than he did." The threat was naked and brutal. He was telling her that he knew exactly who she was, that he knew about the debt, and that he could make her vanish too. Panic seized Lydia's throat. Her instinct was to shrink back, to hide behind Dominic. But then she remembered the hours of agonizing fear her father had put her through, the nights she spent crying over her mother's care bills, and the sheer audacity of this monster threatening her in a room full of police. A sudden reckless fire ignited in Lydia's chest. She didn't step back. Instead, she tilted her chin up, looking Victor dead in his shark eyes. "I don't believe in luck, Mr. Castellano," Lydia said, her voice ringing clear and steady over the jazz music. "I believe in making smart choices, and as you can see." She reached up, placing her hand flat against Dominic's chest, letting her massive diamond catch the chandelier light right in Victor's face. "I have made the smartest choice of all. Dominic takes very good care of what belongs to him." Victor's eyes widened slightly in genuine surprise. He hadn't expected the terrified waitress to have teeth. Dominic let out a low, dark chuckle that vibrated through Lydia's hand resting on his chest. He pulled her even tighter against him, burying his face briefly in her hair before looking back at Victor with a gaze that promised absolute destruction. "She is quite something, isn't she, Victor?" Dominic asked softly. "My advice to you is to stay very far away from my future wife. She has a terrible allergy to old dying things." Victor's face flushed a dark, angry red. The pleasant facade completely shattered. He glared at Dominic, then at Lydia, before turning on his heel and marching away, his goons scrambling to follow. As soon as Victor was out of earshot, Lydia's adrenaline broke. Her knees buckled slightly, but Dominic's strong arm caught her effortlessly, supporting her entire weight. "Get the car," Dominic barked into his lapel microphone. He looked down at Lydia, his icy eyes blazing with something entirely new. It wasn't just possessiveness anymore. It was respect. "We are leaving." The drive back to the Hamptons estate was cloaked in a heavy, suffocating silence. The adrenaline of the gala had evaporated, leaving Lydia utterly exhausted and vibrating with a strange, lingering tension. She stared out the window at the dark highway, the reflection of her emerald dress mocking her. She had played the Mafia queen perfectly, but now the reality of her gilded cage was sinking back in. When they arrived at the compound, Dominic didn't say a word. He walked her up the grand staircase and stopped outside the door of her suite. The two armed guards stationed in the hallway respectfully averted their eyes. "You did well tonight," Dominic finally said, his voice lower, rougher than usual. He stood entirely too close to her, the scent of his masculine cologne wrapping around her senses. "He knew who I was," Lydia whispered, staring at his chest. "Victor, he's not going to just let this go, is he?" Dominic reached out his knuckles, gently brushing against her cheek. The touch was so tender it made Lydia's breath hitch. It was completely at odds with the violent man she knew him to be. "I told you," Dominic murmured, his thumb tracing her jawline. "He will not touch you. You are under my protection. You proved tonight that you belong at my side." Lydia looked up, meeting his intense gaze. "But it's a lie, Dominic. All of this. The ring, the dress, the contract. It's just a game to you to win a war." Dominic stepped closer, backing her up against the heavy oak door. His eyes darkened, the icy blue turning into a stormy, dangerous sea. He leaned down, his face inches from hers. "Is it?" he whispered, his voice vibrating with a raw, undeniable hunger. "Tell me, Lydia, when you stood up to Victor tonight, when you put your hand on my chest, did that feel like a lie?" Lydia couldn't speak. Her heart was beating so fast she thought it might shatter her ribs. The fear she had felt for this man was slowly, terrifyingly twisting into something else. Something dark, magnetic, and completely irrational. Dominic didn't wait for an answer. He leaned in, his lips brushing softly against hers. It was a question, a hesitation testing the waters. When Lydia didn't push him away, when she actually let out a soft gasp and tilted her head up, his restraint broke. He kissed her, his mouth slanting over hers with a bruising, desperate intensity. One of his hands tangled in her chestnut hair, holding her in place, while the other gripped her waist, pulling her flush against his solid frame. Lydia's hands moved instinctively, gripping the lapels of his tuxedo as she kissed him back, entirely consumed by the dangerous fire of the man holding her. It was a kiss born of adrenaline, fear, and a terrifying, undeniable chemistry. When Dominic finally pulled away, his chest was heaving. He rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. "Go to sleep, Lydia," he rasped, his voice strained. He stepped back abruptly, putting distance between them, as if she had burned him. Without another word, he turned and strode down the hallway toward his own wing of the estate. Lydia slipped into her room, sliding down the door until she hit the floor. She touched her swollen lips, her mind a chaotic whirlwind. She was falling for the monster holding her captive. 3 hours later, the estate was dead silent. Lydia couldn't sleep. The lingering feeling of Dominic's kiss kept her tossing and turning. Her throat was parched. Deciding she needed water, she quietly got out of bed, slipped on her silk robe, and cracked her door open. The two guards were gone. Lydia frowned. Dominic had been adamant about her protection. Why would the guards abandon their post? A chilling sense of unease washed over her. She stepped out into the dimly lit hallway, her bare feet making no sound on the plush carpet. She made her way toward the grand staircase, intending to go down to the massive chef's kitchen. As she reached the balcony overlooking the foyer, she heard hushed voices coming from the shadows near Dominic's private study. Lydia froze, pressing herself flat against the marble balustrade. She peered over the edge. Down below, illuminated only by the moonlight filtering through the windows, stood Leo Moretti. He was holding a burner phone to his ear, his usually jovial face twisted into an ugly, furious sneer. Standing next to him, looking nervous and exhausted, was a man Lydia recognized instantly. It was Thomas, the senior waiter from the club, the man who was supposed to have fled to Victor Castellano. "You're an idiot, Thomas!" Leo hissed into the phone, speaking rapidly. "You were supposed to plant the poison, leave the envelope, and disappear. You weren't supposed to let the Bennett girl see you sweat." Lydia's blood ran cold. She stopped breathing. I know," Thomas stammered, wringing his hands. "But Paul pushed the tray on her. It wasn't my fault. I did what you paid me to do, Leo. I made it look like Victor ordered the hit." Leo hung up the burner phone, turning his deadly glare onto Thomas. The boss wanted Victor framed flawlessly to justify a full-scale war to the commission. We needed Dominic to look like the victim. The Bennett girl interfering wasn't part of the plan. So what do we do about her? Thomas asked nervously. She thinks Dominic is saving her from Victor. She doesn't know Dominic's men are the ones who bought her father's debt months ago to force him into hiding. Dominic created this whole trap just to get his hands on her. Lydia pressed her hand hard over her mouth to stifle a scream. Her father hadn't abandoned her. Victor Castellano hadn't poisoned Dominic's drink. Dominic Russo had orchestrated the entire assassination attempt on his own life. He had fabricated the gang war, he had hidden her father, and he had manipulated every single event of the past 24 hours to ensure she fell perfectly helplessly into his trap. He didn't save her from the cage. He was the one who built it. The cold marble of the balcony railing bit into Lydia's hands as she scrambled back from the edge, her breath trapped in her throat. The hushed, furious voices of Leo Moretti and Thomas the waiter echoed in her mind, repeating the damning truth like a broken record. The boss wanted Victor framed flawlessly. Dominic created this whole trap just to get his hands on her. Lydia pressed her back against the nearest wall, sliding down into the shadows of the second-floor landing. Her entire body trembled violently. The dizzying cocktail of fear, adrenaline, and that confusing magnetic pull she had felt during their kiss evaporated, replaced instantly by an icy, nauseating clarity. Dominic Russo had not saved her life. He was the architect of her destruction. Every single terrifying event of the last 24 hours had been a meticulously engineered stage play, and she was nothing but a puppet dancing on strings she couldn't even see. He had bought her father's debt months ago, forcing her estranged dad into hiding to leave Lydia entirely vulnerable. He had hired Thomas to fake the poisoning, counting on Lydia's sharp observational skills. His invasive background checks had undoubtedly highlighted to spot the trap and save him. He had orchestrated a fake assassination attempt to justify a bloodbath with the Castellano family to the New York Mafia Commission, while simultaneously backing Lydia into a corner so tight she had no choice but to sign away her life to him. The prenuptial agreement, the trust funds, the house in Aspen, it wasn't just a cover for the federal government, it was a legally binding net. Lydia squeezed her eyes shut, fighting the urge to vomit. She wanted to scream. She wanted to run down the stairs, find the nearest heavy object, and smash it over Dominic's head. But as her panic crested, a chilling survivalist instinct took over. If she ran, she had nothing. Dominic controlled her bank accounts, her legal identity, and most terrifyingly, her mother's medical care. If she confronted him with no leverage, he would simply lock her in a gilded vault and throw away the key. He was a sociopath who viewed human lives as chess pieces. You don't beat a chess master by flipping the board. Lydia thought, her jaw tightening as a new dark resolve settled over her. You beat him by becoming the queen. She quietly stood up, smoothing down her silk robe, and slipped back into her bedroom like a ghost. She didn't sleep a single wink that night. She sat in the dark, staring at the flawless 5-carat diamond on her finger, plotting her survival. The next morning, the heavy oak door unlocked precisely at 8. Sarah, the severe-looking stylist, entered with a fresh garment bag. "Good morning, Miss Bennett. Mr. Russo is taking his coffee on the South Terrace. He expects you to join him," Sarah announced crisply. Lydia didn't flinch. She didn't argue. She stood up, her expression a perfectly blank canvas. "Of course. Let's get ready." 40 minutes later, Lydia walked out onto the sun-drenched South Terrace. She wore tailored cream-colored cashmere sweater and wide-legged trousers that whispered of quiet luxury. Her hair was pulled back into a sleek, elegant knot. She looked every inch the polished, untouchable Mafia bride. Dominic was sitting at a wrought-iron table reading the Wall Street Journal, a cup of black coffee steaming in front of him. He looked up as she approached, his icy blue eyes scanning her face, searching for any lingering traces of the terrified girl from last night, or perhaps the flushed, yielding woman he had kissed in the hallway. He found neither. "Good morning," Lydia said smoothly, taking the seat across from him. She reached for the silver coffee pot and poured herself a cup, her hand perfectly steady. Dominic's eyes narrowed by a fraction of a millimeter. He folded the newspaper. "Did you sleep well?" "Surprisingly, yes." Lydia lied, taking a sip of the bitter coffee. She met his gaze directly. "I suppose knowing I'm under the protection of the city's most powerful man brings a certain kind of peace, though I was hoping for an update on my mother." "She is settled at the Mount Sinai private wing." Dominic said, his voice, a low, smooth baritone that no longer sent shivers down her spine, but rather set her teeth on edge. "She has a private nurse and 24-hour security. Victor's men couldn't get within a mile of her without my permission." "Thank you, Dominic," Lydia said, forcing a warm, appreciative smile. It was the hardest thing she had ever done, looking into the eyes of her captor and feigning gratitude. "I want to be useful to you. If I am going to be your fiancé, if I am going to sit beside you in front of the other families, I need to understand your world. I refuse to be a liability." Dominic leaned back in his chair, studying her with a mix of surprise and intense predatory interest. He had expected tears this morning. He'd expected demands to go home, or perhaps a shy, awkward retreat after their kiss. He hadn't expected a strategic pivot. "My world is not for the faint of heart, Lydia," he warned quietly. "Neither was paying off $150,000 in gambling debts to a man like Victor Castellano." Lydia shot back seamlessly. "I survived that. I can survive this. Tell me about the commission. Tell me how the 5 families operate." For the next 2 hours, Dominic spoke, and Lydia listened. She acted the part of the fascinated, loyal partner, soaking in every detail about shipping routes, union bribes, shell corporations, and the delicate, bloody politics that kept the New York underworld from tearing itself apart. She learned that the commission, the ruling council of the 5 families, abhorred unnecessary wars. A boss could only strike another boss if there was undeniable proof of betrayal or an unprovoked attack. That's why he needed the club hit to look real, Lydia realized, carefully filing the information away. If the commission finds out Dominic faked the hit to start a war with Victor, they will authorize a hit on Dominic to maintain the peace. That was it. That was his weak point. Now all she needed was the proof. 3 agonizing days bled into one another. To the glittering high society of Manhattan, Lydia and Dominic were the picture of a sudden intoxicating romance. Photographed leaving the exclusive Le Bernardin in Midtown, snapped by paparazzi walking the manicured grounds of the Hamptons estate, Lydia played the part of the untouchable Mafia bride with terrifying perfection. She wore the tailored Carolina Herrera gowns that Sarah the stylist selected. She smiled a perfectly hollow smile whenever Dominic's heavy hand rested possessively on the small of her back. But beneath the flawless makeup and the blinding 5-carat diamond on her finger, Lydia was waging a silent psychological war. She mapped every inch of the compound. She memorized the shift changes of the armed guards. Most importantly, she identified the fortress within the fortress, Dominic's private West Wing study. It was completely off-limits, sealed tight by a biometric lock. The break she desperately needed arrived on the 4th night, heralded by the shrill, deafening shriek of the estate's perimeter alarms at 1:15 a.m. Lydia jolted upright in bed, her heart hammering against her ribs. Heavy combat boots thundered down the hallway. Victor's guys just hit the Red Hook shipping terminal. Leo Moretti's voice roared from the grand foyer, echoing up the sweeping mahogany staircase. They torched 2 of the overseas freighters. Let's move. Lydia cracked her bedroom door open just in time to see Dominic striding down the hall. Gone was the bespoke tuxedo. He was dressed in matte black tactical gear, a suppressed Heckler and Koch MP5 slung over his broad shoulder, his face a mask of cold, lethal fury. Within 3 minutes, the heavy front doors slammed shut, and a convoy of armored SUVs roared down the driveway. The interior of the mansion fell eerily silent, guarded only by a skeleton crew, hyper-focused on the exterior walls. This was her only chance. Lydia threw off her Egyptian cotton sheets, pulling on a pair of dark leggings and a tight black sweater. She slipped out of her room, moving like a ghost over the plush carpets. She bypassed the study entirely, at first heading straight for the third-floor master suite. She had noticed days ago that while the study required a fingerprint, there was a manual override slot beneath the scanner. A man as paranoid as Dominic wouldn't leave a master key out in the open, but he also wouldn't rely solely on digital technology. She remembered the custom-tailored charcoal Brioni suit he had worn to a sit-down with a union boss yesterday. Hard in her throat, she rifled through his cavernous walk-in closet until she found the jacket. Her fingers frantically traced the silk lining until she felt a tiny, hard lump sewn directly into the left lapel. Grabbing a pair of silver grooming scissors from the vanity, she snipped the heavy thread. A small titanium skeleton key dropped into her sweating palm. Lydia sprinted back down the stairs, navigating the shadows, until she reached the heavy oak double doors of the West Wing study. She jammed the key into the tiny override slot. Click. The heavy doors swung inward with a heavy oiled sigh. The study was massive, steeped in darkness and the faint scent of old leather and expensive scotch. Lydia moved directly behind the sprawling mahogany desk. She dropped to her knees, running her hands desperately along the intricate oak paneling until her fingers caught a subtle groove. She pressed hard. A section of the wood popped open to reveal a heavy brushed steel safe. 041889. She punched in the numbers, the date of his father's assassination, which she had seen him trace absent-mindedly on his platinum watch face. The heavy steel bolts retracted with a solid, echoing clank. Lydia pulled the heavy door open. Inside rested stacks of banded $100 bills, velvet pouches, and a stack of black leather ledgers. But at the very bottom lay a thick, heavily classified manila folder. Printed across the top in bold black ink was a single word, Bennett. Lydia's breath hitched. She pulled the folder out, spreading the contents across the dark mahogany desk. Her stomach violently dropped out. It was a complete, agonizingly detailed dossier on her entire life. There were surveillance photos of her walking to her tiny Brooklyn apartment. There were medical records for her mother smuggled out of Mount Sinai. But the killing blow was a signed contract from a mid-level loan shark affiliated with the Castellano family. Attached to it was a wire transfer receipt originating from a Russo shell corporation dated 5 months ago. Dominic hadn't bought her father's debt last week to save her. He had anonymously bought the debt months ago, acting as the shadow creditor, explicitly ordering the loan sharks to violently turn up the pressure on her father until the man broke and vanished. He had deliberately engineered her financial ruin to force her into working at the Onyx Room. He had hunted her, looking for some light reading. The voice cut through the heavy silence of the study like a serrated blade. Lydia screamed, spinning around so fast she knocked a stack of papers to the floor. Standing in the doorway, bleeding from a shallow graze on his cheek and smelling of cordite and rain, was Dominic Russo. He held his handgun loosely by his thigh, his icy blue eyes locked onto her. He looked utterly unrepentant. "You're supposed to be in Brooklyn," Lydia choked out, backing up until her hips hit the desk. "A minor distraction," Dominic said smoothly, stepping into the room and letting the doors click shut, locking them inside together. "I left Leo to mop up the blood. I had a feeling my brilliant, observant fiancé might take advantage of the empty house." He walked slowly toward her, a predator cornering its prey, his eyes dropping to the sprawling contents of the Bennett folder. "You found it. You planned it," Lydia breathed hot tears of raw, blinding rage, finally spilling over her lashes. She grabbed the bank transfer receipt, shoving it toward his chest. "You bought the debt. You drove my father into hiding. You pushed my mother to the brink of eviction just so I would be desperate enough to work at that club." "Yes," Dominic stated flatly. Not a single ounce of guilt crossed his carved features. "Ooh!" Lydia screamed, the sound tearing from her throat. She slapped him hard across the face. The crack echoed sharply in the cavernous room. Dominic's head snapped to the side. He stood perfectly still for 3 agonizing seconds before slowly turning his head back. He raised his free hand, gripping her jaw with his rough, calloused fingers, forcing her to look up into his storm-tossed eyes. "Because I saw you, Lydia!" Dominic growled, his voice vibrating with a dark, terrifying obsession. He backed her up against the edge of the desk, his massive frame trapping her. "6 months ago, I watched a 20-year-old girl drag her sick mother out of a burning apartment building in Queens. I watched you work 3 jobs, taking beatings from loan sharks to protect a degenerate father. I saw a girl with the spine of a soldier and the mind of a tactician wasting her life in civilian squalor." He leaned in his face mere inches from hers. "I am surrounded by men who would sell my blood for $1. I needed a Queen Lydia. I needed someone strong enough to stand beside me in the fire. I tore down your weak, pathetic life so I could give you an empire." Lydia thrashed against his grip. "It's a lie. You don't want a partner, you want a pet." "If I wanted a pet, I would have broken you." Dominic roared back, his icy composure shattering entirely, revealing the violent, untamed passion beneath. "Do you think I would have let you stand up to Victor Castellano in front of half the city if I didn't want you to have fangs? You proved me right tonight, Lydia. You broke into my safe. You outsmarted my guards. You belong in my world." Lydia stared at him, her chest heaving as adrenaline burned through her veins. The terrified waitress died right there on the mahogany desk, and something cold and sharp was born in her place. She reached down, moving deliberately. She didn't grab the photos or the debt contracts. She grabbed the thick-coated black ledger, the operational framework of his entire syndicate. The book that could send him to a federal prison for life or get him executed by the commission. She held it tight against her chest. Dominic's rage vanished instantly, replaced by a razor-sharp stillness. "Put that down, Lydia," he warned, his voice dangerously low. "No," Lydia said, her voice completely steady, the tears gone. "You said I was a tactician. Let's talk tactics, Dominic." The silence in the study was absolute. The air crackled with a lethal electricity. Dominic didn't move toward her, but his entire body was coiled like a spring ready to snap. "That ledger contains the operational framework of my entire syndicate." Dominic said, his words measured and precise. "If the feds get that my family falls, if the commission gets that I am executed by dawn, you are playing a very dangerous game, amor mio." "Don't call me that." Lydia snapped, her grip on the leather book tightening. She met his lethal gaze without flinching. "You engineered this entire situation because you wanted a queen. But you forgot one fundamental rule about chess, Dominic. The queen is the most dangerous piece on the board. She can move anywhere she wants." A slow, terrifying smirk began to curl at the corner of Dominic's mouth. He wasn't angry anymore. He was utterly captivated. "And where are you moving, Lydia?" "I know how the commission works," Lydia stated, her voice ringing clear in the dark room. "You told me yourself. They abhor unprovoked wars. If I walk out of this house and hand this ledger along with this file proving you faked the club hit and dragged a civilian into family business, the commission won't just kill you. They will erase the Russo name from history." Dominic tilted his head, studying her like a fascinating puzzle. "You wouldn't make it to the front gates." "Maybe not," Lydia countered, her heart hammering against her ribs. "But are you willing to risk it? Are you willing to shoot your perfect queen to keep your secret?" Dominic stared at her. The seconds ticked by heavy and suffocating. Lydia held her breath, knowing she was standing on a razor's edge. If she had miscalculated his obsession with her, he would pull his gun and kill her right here. Suddenly, Dominic threw his head back and laughed. It wasn't a warm laugh. It was a dark, rough sound that echoed off the vaulted ceiling, the sound of a man who had just bet his entire fortune and drawn a winning hand. He stepped back, crossing his arms over his broad chest. "Magnificent. Utterly magnificent. You've got my life in your hands, Lydia. Tell me your terms." Lydia swallowed hard, forcing her voice to remain steady. "First, the debt is gone. Not transferred, not held over my head, erased, and my mother's care facility is permanently endowed for the rest of her life in my name, with funds completely detached from Russo accounts." "Done," Dominic said without hesitation. "What else?" "Second." Lydia continued, stepping away from the desk, standing tall in the center of the room. "The prenuptial agreement is torn up. I am not your property. I am not a civilian you control on a piece of paper. If I am staying in this house, if I'm going to be your wife and stand by your side in this war, I do it as a full equal partner. I get a seat at the table. I know where the money goes. I know who makes the hits. I am never left in the dark again." Dominic's eyes burned with a dark territorial fire. He uncrossed his arms and closed the distance between them in 3 long strides. He didn't reach for the ledger. Instead, he reached out and gently gripped the back of her neck, his thumb tracing the pulse racing at her throat. "You want to step into the blood, Lydia," he whispered, his face inches from hers. "You want to carry the weight of this family. It will ruin your soul." "You already ruined my life," Lydia whispered back, her gaze locked on his lips. "I might as well rule yours." Dominic let out a ragged breath. He crushed his mouth against hers. This kiss wasn't a test, and it wasn't a manipulation. It was a violent, desperate surrender. It was the sealing of a blood oath. Lydia dropped the ledger. It hit the floor with a heavy thud, forgotten, as she wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him closer, anchoring herself to the beautiful, terrifying monster who had dragged her into the dark. She had lost the quiet, ordinary life she'd been fighting so hard to keep. But as Dominic's strong hands swept her up, pinning her against the wall, as their kiss deepened into something raw and consuming, Lydia realized she didn't want the quiet life anymore. The Castellanos were coming. The commission was watching. The streets of New York were about to run red with blood. But Lydia Bennett wasn't a terrified waitress anymore. She was the Russo queen, and she was going to burn the city to the ground. What a massive, explosive shift in power. Lydia completely flipped the script, taking Dominic's terrifying manipulation and using it to crown herself the ultimate Mafia queen. Their chemistry is absolutely lethal, and now that they are a true equal team, Victor Castellano and the entire New York Commission have no idea what is coming for them. The game of survival just turned into a war for empire. If you were blown away by Lydia's brilliant checkmate and this dark romance, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video. Drop a comment below. Who do you think will strike first in the upcoming Russo-Castellano war?